And before this took place, Sheikh Hasina was informed that she needs to flee the country, she needs to resign, she needs to go away from the country, or else she will be assassinated. The US actually wanted a regime change in Bangladesh. The US was not happy with Sheikh Hasina and her closeness with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the current Indian government. In a shocking turn of events, Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has resigned and fled the country. She fled to India first, and now she's planning to seek asylum in the UK, in London to be more specific. But what happened in Bangladesh? What actually led to Sheikh Hasina's ouster from the country? When she was in fact ruling the country for the last 15 years and she had been in power for about 20 odd years. And what's even more surprising is that this is coming after she had just recently won elections in Bangladesh in January earlier this year. Was this because of the ongoing protests in Bangladesh? Or was there an involvement of an external force, or forces rather? And how does it affect India and Bangladesh's relations moving forward? We're going to talk about all of that in this video here. Now first, let us talk about the ongoing protests. But for that, we'll have to go back in history. So right after Bangladesh's independence in 1971, the Bangladeshi government had actually announced a 30% reservation or quota for freedom fighters in government jobs. And that made sense at that point of time for freedom fighters because they had fought for the country's independence. But later on, the quota was extended to the children of the freedom fighters. And that too made sense because many freedom fighters lost their lives. But in 2010, this quota was further extended to the grandchildren of the freedom fighters. Now, this is where problems started to arise. There were protests in the country as to why this quota was being implemented and extended to the grandchildren of the freedom fighters. But nothing was done regarding this extension of the quota up until 2018, when there were further protests by student groups in the country in order to get this quota removed. Initially, the petition was rejected, but then the protests grew and grew, and the government had to remove this quota. So the government removed the 30% quota from the first and second class government jobs. And after that, things started to get better in Bangladesh. But this was only up till June 2024. Now, we also need to understand that this particular quota, the 30% quota, was not the only quota that was in the government sector. All in all, 56% of the government jobs were basically reserved. 30% were reserved for freedom fighters, 10% for women, and the remaining jobs that were reserved were meant for basically people with disabilities, people coming from underdeveloped districts of the country, and so on. And only 44% of the jobs were offered on merit. And we also need to understand that private jobs in Bangladesh, they were not doing much for the people of the country. And that is why many of these students, they were resorting to government jobs, which were again reserved heavily. Now, in June earlier this year, 2 months ago, High Court of Bangladesh had received a petition that the quota that was removed was illegally removed. And this was a petition that was filed by the descendants of the freedom fighters. And after that, the High Court had ordered to reinstate this quota system, the old quota system, and hence the 30% quota system was now back in the country. And this is where the protests began again in July 2024. Now, you must be thinking that it was the High Court that actually ordered to reinstate this particular quota. But why were there protests against Sheikh Hasina? Now, the opposition party leaders and the students, they have argued and they have believed that this quota was in place only because Sheikh Hasina and Awami League wanted to remain in power. Because they believed that Sheikh Hasina and Awami League, they were basically using this particular quota to stay in power and to benefit their own people, the people that were related to the party somehow or the government somehow in some manner. And these protests were initially peaceful protests. They started out as peaceful protests, but they turned violent when the government started to attack these students, the protesters. Not just attack, but actually kill many of these protesters. So about 200 student protesters were killed in these protests, and that is just the official number. An official number is pretty much higher than that. And at that point of time, the government thought that this would lead to the protests being shut down. This will lead to country returning to peace. But this is not what was in store for the Bangladeshi government. The student protesters had no intention of stopping at that point of time. And this protest had turned even more violent at that point of time, which led for the government to actually listen to these protesters. And as a result of that, the quota system that was again reinstated was taken aback. And now, out of the 56% of the total reservation that was implemented in the government sector in the country, it came down to just 7%. So, of the 30% jobs that were reserved for freedom fighters, now that number had come down to 5%. And merit-based jobs increased from 44% to 93%. And to this, the government thought that now the protests will stop. now there will be peace in the country. But this is not what had happened. The student protesters wanted to scrap off the freedom fighter quota entirely. They wanted this removed entirely, and they had come up with a 9-point demand, and one of which was that PM Sheikh Hasina needs to apologize publicly, and that the government needs to compensate to the families of the deceased protesters. Now, these were two of the 9 demands that the protesters had come up with, but these demands, they were not met by the government, and this is where things got even worse. And at that point of time, the protesters had just one demand: resignation from the Prime Minister of the country, resignation from Sheikh Hasina. And at the same time, on Sunday, 100 protesters were killed, and the military of the country was put in charge. But Sheikh Hasina had asked the army to attack the civilians, to which the military said that they were not going to harm the students. They were for the people, not against the people. At that point of time, Sheikh Hasina realized that the army had turned against her. The army was not with her. But while the army had denied attacking the students, the police was still in charge. Not only that, but Awami League student wing, which is the Chhatra League, was also in charge and was also attacking the students. And this did not turn out well for Sheikh Hasina or for her government. The protesters, as I mentioned earlier, they were demanding Sheikh Hasina's resignation, and soon they started marching towards her residence. And before this took place, Sheikh Hasina was informed that she needs to flee the country, she needs to resign, she needs to go away from the country, or else she will be assassinated. And Sheikh Hasina was planning to actually address the country and pack her bags before leaving, but she did not have enough time, and as a result, she fled the country. And right after she fled the country, protesters, they marched into her residence, they looted and plundered her residence, and even destroyed the statue of the founding father of Bangladesh and the father of Sheikh Hasina, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Sheikh Hasina fled to India. She is currently in India, and she is currently seeking asylum in the UK. And right after Sheikh Hasina's ouster, the army chief of Bangladesh, Wakar Uz Zaman, addressed the country, addressed the media, that an interim government was going to be formed in the country, and that he had already talked with other major political party leaders. So while the military chief has said that an interim government will be formed, it is not confirmed how will the next government be formed. Will the country have regular elections after this, or will the military rule the country? Now we'll have to wait and see how things turn out for Bangladesh. At the same time, protesters vandalizing the statue, looting and plundering the residence, and even causing chaos in the streets of Bangladesh after the exit of Sheikh Hasina, it does not sit well. They started attacking Hindu temples and even attacked Hindu minorities' homes, which is not justifiable. Now, whether it is the protesters or the people who are taking advantage of this situation, we do not know, but this is surely not justifiable. So the military chief has said that appropriate action will be taken against those who have caused this chaos, who have led to the killing of hundreds of student protesters in the country, around the country. But let us also look at another side to the exit of Sheikh Hasina. Now, yes, on the face of it, it was the student protests as well as the actions of the government, the actions that the government took that led to the ouster of Sheikh Hasina and her government. But could there be an involvement of external forces? Could there be an involvement of another country or a couple of countries that have supported the exit of Sheikh Hasina? Now, I uploaded a video earlier before the Bangladeshi elections wherein I talked about how the US actually wanted a regime change in Bangladesh. The US was not happy with Sheikh Hasina and her closeness with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the current Indian government. And even Sheikh Hasina had said that there was a bigger country that wanted Sheikh Hasina to be kicked out of the country, and also a country that wanted a military base to be set up in Bangladesh. And if that particular demand was not met, that country would create another country between Bangladesh and Myanmar and set up that military base. And Sheikh Hasina had denied that demand. And soon after the elections took place, the US had actually said that elections in Bangladesh, they were not free and fair. And time and again, Sheikh Hasina has been accused of basically tampering with the elections. Multiple times she had been accused of rigging the elections. But why did the US not want Bangladesh to have closer ties with India when India is a strategic partner of the US and a major resource that can help counterbalance the position of China? Well, the answer in simple terms is that it does not want India to become like China and then challenge the autonomy and power of the US. Now, I've talked more about that in this video here. So if you're interested in watching this video, you can click the link in the description below and watch that video. And not only the US, but there could also be an involvement of China, because China is trying to diminish the influence of India, specifically in the Indian subcontinent. We can see what has happened with Maldives, and we can also see what is happening with Pakistan and China's relations. And on top of that, some intelligence reports have even pointed out the involvement of ISI. ISI does not want a pro-Indian government in Bangladesh. Now, whether or not there was an involvement of the US Pakistan or China or a couple of these countries. We cannot say that with certainty at this point of time. But what does Sheikh Hasina's exit mean for India moving forward? Now we have to understand that the situation specifically at the India-Bangladesh border remains tensed because there is a growing concern of Bangladeshis entering Indian border. And when we look at India's neighbors, be it Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan or Myanmar, all of these countries, they are politically unstable. And when we look at Pakistan, Bangladesh and Myanmar, all of these countries, they have the involvement of the military, which makes it believable that India's influence is not being liked by major superpowers of the world. India's growing influence needs to be curbed before India can take off. And another reason is that India and Bangladesh's relations, they were very good under the leadership of Sheikh Hasina. Specifically in the last 10 years, Sheikh Hasina's relations with the Modi government, they were very good. And now that Sheikh Hasina is gone, if the opposition parties, they come in power, specifically BNP does not have a pro-India policy. So moving forward, India will have to be careful about its ties with its neighboring countries, specifically Bangladesh at this point of time. And in fact, right after Sheikh Hasina's exit from Bangladesh, Indian leaders, including the opposition leaders, they actually came in together. They had a meeting to discuss what was going on in Bangladesh. So with Sheikh Hasina out of Bangladesh, we'll have to wait and see how Bangladesh's politics unfolds. With that being said, what do you think about this? Do you think that there was an involvement of external forces to remove Sheikh Hasina from the country? Will Bangladesh's democracy be restored moving forward? And how will India and Bangladesh's relationship be moving forward? Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. If you found this video valuable, please share this video with your friends and family. And please subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching this video and have a great day.